All right, folks, I think we'll jump in. We'll have still a couple people connecting in, but just a couple quick announcements. Again, remember that our quiz 3 is going to be this coming Wednesday. Everything is exactly the same as it's always been before, so you know what to expect with that. Just make sure that you're going through taking notes on all of the lecture materials, that you've read through all the modules, that you've taken careful notes there, understanding sort of main or bolded and italicized terms. Make sure that you're going through getting big picture messages off of each one of those sections. So go through, make sure that you've got a hold of that. Joanna is going to have SI session tonight at 6:30. She's not able to make it today in class, but she's going to go through. We'll send out a posting. There's going to be a 6:30 SI session. Attend that if you're able to. If not, documents will be uploaded for you to go through and grab and take a look at. We'll also have our review session tomorrow from 5 to 6. I'll send out an announcement there. Again, if you can make it, that's awesome. If you can't, make sure to send me questions. You can link back in and follow that and get caught up if you have to watch that later. Okay. Make sure that you're up and continue on your research. There should be more and more studies popping up. So just keep an eye on that to make sure that you're up and going with all of that business. Okay. Any questions about where we're at, where we're going, sort of any of the material we've covered to this point? Thumbs up. People feeling okay with this? Awesome. Okay, cool. Want to start by just jumping in and finishing up this last slide from Kohlberg's theory of moral development here. Okay. So we had talked, remember with this, lots of different stages. You don't have to worry about individual stage 1, 2, 3, 4. Just focus on these 3 broad overarching categories. Pre-conventional morality. Again, this idea that during these ethical scenarios, we've got people giving sort of very egocentric, sort of rule-driven reasons why Heinz should have stole the drug or shouldn't have stole the drug. We get into conventional morality. Things get a little bit more sophisticated. We see people starting to give justifications that involve Heinz being judged or evaluated by other people, or starting to recognize that Heinz is a member of society and sort of that society has to have rules. The last stage of Kohlberg's stage theory of moral development is what he termed post-conventional morality. Okay, and at this level, what we're seeing is participants starting to give quite sophisticated justifications for why Heinz was justified in stealing the drug or not. Remember that Kohlberg didn't care whether or not people said, yeah, it was good or no, it wasn't. What he was interested in how people constructed their justification for this. And so what we see in post-conventional morality is people starting to give answers that are based on beliefs about basic rights or overarching ethical principles. So at stage 5, we see that justifications or answers recognizing that different people may have different opinions, but sort of compromise greater good types of things. So we might say, yes, Heinz was justified in stealing the drug. It was his duty to save his wife. There could be consequences, but authorities should consider the circumstances, right? So we're getting into a little bit more context and things along those lines. Or someone at stage 5 saying, no, situation is understandable, but the scientist has rights to be compensated, right? And so recognizing the pharmacist's rights and things along those lines. And then finally at stage 6, this is what Kohlberg identified as kind of the highest level. Decisions made based on universal principles of justice and dignity. Sometimes in democracy, justice and dignity can get overlooked. Maybe the majority of individuals don't believe in justice or dignity in certain situation. At stage 6, Kohlberg is identifying reasons based on, okay, there's kind of this higher level of respecting persons and things like that. So what we might see is an answer, something along the lines of, Heinz is justified, human life is worth more than property in any situation. Okay, so this is based on a higher ethical principle. Or Heinz's actions were not justified. Other individuals whose lives are equally important may need the medication, right? So I don't know. Maybe Heinz stole this and there are other people who also needed it, but Heinz took it, so there's no more, and now that puts other people's lives into jeopardy, right? And so in this post-conventional morality, starting to sort of tie in higher order ethical principles and sort of much more nuanced and complex moral reasoning at this level. Okay, so again, as you're going through and studying this, make sure that you've got a good sort of sense of the three main overarching sort of themes, but don't get too stuck in the weeds. Differentiating stage 5, stage 6. If we were in a cognitive or a developmental class, we might do that, but it's more nuanced than I want you to necessarily worry about here. Okay. All right. Then we got a lecture summary. Make sure that you're going through, taking a look at those. Comprehension check. Again, if you pull up these slides on Wild Courses, go through, answer each one of these questions. If you can describe that to someone who's not in the class, it's going to tell you got a pretty good handle on stuff. Okay. All right. Questions on anything in the adolescence slide that we've gone through. People were able to go through, and if you weren't able to pick up last lecture, I went through, recorded a screencast. That's all on there. So even if you missed last Friday, you should be able to go through and get caught up with stuff. Okay. Questions? All right. What we're going to do then, we're going to switch over to the last part here and talk about gender, sexuality, sex, and some basic sort of foundational research in these areas and kind of how psychology is working with some of these controversial themes. All right, so going to start out with sort of gender development, sex, things along these lines. Okay, first thing we're going to talk about is the difference between biological sex and gender. Okay, from a research standpoint, when we're going through and trying to tease these things apart, it's very important to recognize that biological sex is a very different thing than self-identified gender identity. Okay, if we're talking about sex, this is the biological determination based on physiological characteristics of an individual. Okay, and at the biological level, we're looking at basically sex organs, testes, ovaries, chromosomal stuff. Okay, and so what we generally do is, so we've got male, female, right? Sort of if I have testes and my chromosome is XY, I'm biological male. If chromosomes are XX, sex chromosomes, and I have ovaries, biologically female. But then what we have in between this, and about 1% of live births are going to be fall into this intersex category, right? And intersex is going to be individuals who are born with ambiguous genitalia, anomalies in the reproductive organs, sort of chromosomal makeup that doesn't quite match sort of what we're seeing physiologically. And so what we get into here is we generally think sort of male, female in terms of sex, which is 99% of the time where people fall, but then there is this intersex group that we need to recognize as well. And this has started to, in recent years, started to become controversial in some areas, particularly in athletics, right? I've got an individual who identifies as female, biologically looks to be female, presents as female, but may sort of have a chromosomal anomaly where chromosomes look more male than female, right? And then the question is should this person be allowed to participate in competitive like athletics, track and field, and things like that? And so big, really interesting controversies within this area. Okay, so this is biological sex. This is based on sort of my physiology, right? But then we have gender. Gender is a separate thing, okay? Gender refers to attitudes, behaviors that a given culture associates with a biological sex, okay? And the important thing to remember here is that gender exists on a continuum from masculinity to femininity, right? And in Western culture, what we have are certain characteristics that we associate with women, cultural characteristics we associate with men. Gender refers to the extent to which on that continuum where people identify with some of these cultural norms associated with stuff. Okay. And so your gender identity involves your internal experience of being male, female, based on the rules ascribed by sort of Western American society, right? So I could feel I'm biologically male and may identify as being very, very male, right? Which a lot of people do. I could also be biologically male and identify as sort of more in the middle, maybe sort of more feminine characteristics. I might even, in some individuals, identify as very strongly female. And if that's the case, what we get into individuals who identify as transgender, okay? These are going to be individuals whose gender identity, right, their feeling of themselves and their body is different than what's typically associated with biological sex, okay? So if I am a biological male and I identify very strongly as female, like my existence feels female, I feel female inside, what I might sort of qualify me as, I might identify as a transgender woman, right? Or if I'm female, identify as very male, could sort of identify as a transgender man, okay? Now, cisgender, this is where we go through and identify people with, so I'm a biologically male, I identify as male, identify that as cisgender for people who sort of tend to fall sort of along this continuum. Okay. Now, the important thing to remember is that this is just your sense of, we study gender and qualify this as your sense of being characteristically male, female, or somewhere in between, sort of along this continuum, right? And gender is very, very predictive, much more predictive of behavior than biological sex. Okay. Now, just because, so we think about like growing up in Wyoming, right? Not uncommon for biological female women to grow up on ranches and sort of out and sort of take on very characteristic, what we would typically think of as male characteristics, and still identify very closely as female. I'm a woman. I'm just sort of out there, sort of moving cows, doing stuff, working on oil rigs, what have you, right? And so what's important to remember is a lot of variation going on here, and that gender is different than sexual orientation, right? Oftentimes people get these confused, and when we start to sort of not separate these appropriately, making mistakes and assumptions about behavior that start to get really problematic if we're trying to understand this from a psychological level, okay? So here we've got gender development and separating sex from gender. And what we see when we're looking at differences across sex, we see very clear differences, right? Men have very, at least sort of in Western society, sort of American society, sort of if we're looking at within our culture, our own culture, differences across men and women, but also very clear differences in physical makeup, right? We see differences across men and women in terms of height, muscle mass, developmental timeline, okay? Sort of how women tend to develop earlier than, young women tend to develop earlier than boys do. Lifespan, women tend to live longer than men do. These are very, very clear, obvious differences in terms of physical differences across biological sex, right? We also see very clear differences in social interpersonal stuff. Okay, we see differences in men and women in terms of dominance, right? Men tend to be sort of more dominant within the context of social relationships. Women tend to report higher levels of intimacy. So we see differences in dependency. Aggression is an interesting one. And again, this research is really interesting. Generally, men tend to report higher levels of physical, sort of overt aggression. In many studies, women, however, tend to report higher levels of relational aggression, right? So it looks like sort of equal levels overall in terms of aggressive behavior. It just looks a little bit different depending on what we're looking at. Differences in motivation. So we see very, very real differences across biological men, biological women. And we also see these things manifest in terms of different psychological differences, right? We see risk for depression and anxiety. Women at twice the risk of developing anxiety disorders, depression, as men do, and we don't know why. Historically, we've seen women at greater risk for eating pathology, although that's starting to change. Men are starting to develop more eating difficulties. Suicide is interesting. Women with higher risk for attempts. Men at higher levels are risk for completed suicide. Alcohol substance use, technically this is just tended to be higher levels of risk in men, although women are catching up with this. Differences in ADHD, autism, personality pathology, some really interesting stuff here, and some concerns that we've sort of basically taken the same pathology and sort of identified it differently if you're a man versus you're a woman, right? If you have a lot of variable behaviors, you're sort of unpredictable, sort of have difficulties regulating emotions and things like that, more likely if you're a female that we say ascribe a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, whereas if we see some variation of the same behavior in males, we identify it as antisocial personality disorder. So interesting conversations about how our cultural expectations of men versus women start to creep into not only sort of everyday life, but also our science. Okay. Questions about sex, gender differences that were sort of covered up to this point? All right. Influences. Okay, so we're seeing differences, right? Men are different than women. That's not a it is controversial, but it's very clear, depending on our metric, that we do see differences across sex, right? And so the question is where do these differences come from, right? This is, again, going back to that nature versus nurture question. Well, from a biological standpoint, sex chromosomes, right? You have two sex chromosomes, one from the mother, one from the father. Father's sperm carries the sex chromosome. Biological women, XX sex chromosomes, men, XY, and early in development, what we see is we get that combination of that XY sex chromosome pair, in addition to some early exposure to androgens, testosterone types of stuff early on. What we see is that sort of developing into biological men. So early on, sort of combination of sex chromosomes, prenatal hormonal influence, determining biological sex, right? But when we get into cultural environmental issues, this is where we start to see gender roles start to take place, okay? Gender roles referred to within our culture, sort of what defines expectations of men versus women, okay? So someone tell me, give me an example. Again, this is a norm thing, right? There's no sort of rules. We don't get a packet when we were born and say, hey, this is how you act. We just pick this up through sort of going through life, right? So someone give me an example of a male gender role. Sort of what behaviors do we in American society traditionally associate with maleness?
Protectiveness of family.
Protectiveness of family. Okay, I'm the protector, I'm the provider. Men are the ones who are supposed to be going out and sort of breadwinners and things like that. Yeah. What about female gender role? Someone give me an example there.
Administering to children and not necessarily childbirthing, but raising children.
Yeah, well, we kind of have to do the childbirthing. We have other options available to us at this juncture, sort of maybe in the future. But yeah, you're exactly right, Court, that women are the homemakers. They're the ones who sort of take care of the child. They're the ones who experience feelings and sort of care about other people, right? Where men are out with our clubs and sort of bringing home the bacon type of stuff, right? And so these gender roles, right? And there's a whole bunch of them. We don't even sort of notice them most times, but we notice when people violate them, right? If people aren't falling in line with the culturally prescribed behaviors, what we start to see is subtle corrections to get people back in line. And this is where social learning theory comes in. Social learning theory suggests that gender identity influenced by observations reinforcement within our society, right? So even if I'm sort of don't get like, okay, here, Josh, here's the list of rules to be male, right? What I do is just living my life. I see things that are male stuff. I see things that are women stuff. And if I live particularly in a sort of traditional household, what I might do is I might start to get subtle punishments for sort of violating gender roles, right? So if I'm a young boy and I'm playing with trucks and hitting stuff with sticks and sort of jumping off things, trying to break my neck, right? Oh, that's just boys being boys. He's just a boy. He's just being a boy, right? But if I start maybe playing with dolls, right, or having tea parties, or wearing sort of certain colors or things like that, what message I might receive is, oh, hey, that's for girls. Don't do that. Here, do this. Something along those lines, right? And it doesn't take a lot, sort of whether it's explicit or not explicit, for us to start to realize, okay, these are the norms. I get good attention for this. I get bad attention for that, which starts to steer me into certain types of behaviors that then become reinforced moving forward, okay? And again, social learning theory suggests that sort of this is how, sort of through this reinforcement punishment, this is how we start to acquire gender-specific behavior. Now, I will say that there's research that suggests, that indicates very clearly that the behavior of young boys is different than the behavior of young girls, right? And people who say, well, I want my child to be able to identify and express their behavior in any way that they want, right? Still often find that boys want to run around and sort of hit things with sticks, and girls tend to be more social, even if we're trying to even things out. Now, there's a lot of external influences, media, things like that, other peer groups that start to influence it. But again, it looks like everything else. There's this combination of biology and society and environmental influences that interact together to sort of determine sort of behavior. Okay, so again, nature and nurture, probably not actually the way it goes, probably influences with both, but these two interacting in a complex way sort of start to produce different types of behaviors. Okay. But what we do know, particularly if we're doing cross-cultural research, is recognizing that across time and culture, some pretty significant differences in terms of what's stereotyped male or female behavior, right? Depending on what time I live in, what country I live in, we start to see some of these sex differences that we see in American society and Western society, which particularly in the U.S. is a very, very gendered sort of prescribed roles. It's not sort of, culture has changed, but still relative to many other countries, very specific on what's appropriate behavior for women versus what's appropriate behavior for men. And we see in different countries that these sort of gender differences that we see in American society start to become less noticeable in more egalitarian societies, sort of particularly Scandinavian countries, where the roles of men and women sort of start to be a little bit more interchangeable. Okay, so again, recognizing environmental influences, but these things aren't independently sort of happening outside of sort of biology and that type of thing. Okay. Questions about sort of any of this stuff here? Okay. Thinking about, again, going back to biology, thinking about sexual motivation, okay? The things that start to influence, if we're going off of biological sex and gender, starting to look at sexual behavior, sexual activity, which is a different thing. So gender, sexual orientation, sexual behavior, separate things, okay? But what we do is we start to see sexual behavior being driven, at least to some extent, by sort of the types of hormones that our body is producing. Estrogen, again, this is probably not news, hopefully not news to anybody, is a primary female sex hormone produced primarily in the ovaries, and sort of peak levels of estrogen during ovulation. Okay. And what we see is some evidence for a role of sexual desire. People have interpreted estrogen as having evidence, studies demonstrating evidence of estrogen as having some role in sexual desire and receptivity. Okay, so again, social psychologists who have done some of this stuff finding that on average, women wearing sort of what they have identified as more attractive clothing, reporting increased sexual fantasy, more frequent intercourse during during peak levels of estrogen and ovulation. Okay, and why, I guess, from a biological standpoint, might this make sense?
Because during ovulation, aren't girls more likely to get pregnant and reproduce?
Yep, exactly. Peak levels of reproduction during ovulation, right? And so, from a biological standpoint, from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, it would make sense that during this time of greatest fertility, that women may be more receptive to sexual activity as a means to propagate the species, type of thing. Okay. Switching over to men, primary male hormone being testosterone. Okay, testosterone produced primarily within the testes. Okay, although what I will say is that both sex organs in both men and women produce both estrogen and testosterone. Ovaries produce trace levels of ovaries produce estrogen primarily, but trace levels of testosterone. Testes primarily produce testosterone, but produce trace levels of estrogen. Our adrenal glands kind of hang out on top of your kidneys. Adrenal glands produce testosterone in both men and women. And so it's not like sort of men only have testosterone, no estrogen, women only have estrogen, no testosterone. It's just the predominant sex hormone differs across men and women. Okay. And so again, in men, testosterone produced primarily in the testes. And what we see is strong evidence of testosterone as being an influence on maintaining sexual interest and activity. Okay, people have heard of sort of the term chemical castration? People heard this? Okay, so it's this idea of if we have someone who's been convicted of sex offenses, right? Particularly sex offenses against children. This idea of chemical castration, and what it is medications that shut down the production of testosterone, with the idea that this is going to keep this person from. It's going to decrease sexual interest and sort of reduce opportunities or motivation to perpetrate. Now, if you shut down testosterone, there's a bunch of other stuff that goes on, right? And so this starts to be very controversial within criminal justice. But banking on this very, very strong evidence of the role of testosterone in driving a great deal of sexual motivation. And what we see with animal research is sort of an interesting sort of phenomenon, depending on when sort of castration or sort of the reduction of testosterone takes place, starting to sort of impact what we see. If we've got an animal that's castrated, testes are removed before sexual maturity, oftentimes with that animal, see no sexual behavior or sexualized behaviors sort of going down. And even if you go through and pump it full of testosterone, sort of once it's reached sexual maturity, not a lot of sexual behavior, right? But if we've got an animal that was castrated after sexual maturity, right? After sexual maturity, you take the testes, what you'll see is reduction in sexual motivation and behavior. But if you give that animal testosterone, you'll see a resurgence of that, right? And so it looks like, again, both environment and experience and learning stuff going in sexual motivation and behavior. So again, this interaction of sort of biology and sort of behavioral experience and things like that. Okay. What we also see is testosterone also associated with sexual motivation in women. There are medications for lower arousal in women if there are women who are concerned about low levels of sexual interest. Medications, pharmaceuticals that are largely based on testosterone. If you jumped yourself up with a bunch of steroids, you probably notice an increase in sexual interest. I don't recommend it. It's sort of not good for your body, for anybody. But again, seeing that even in women, testosterone associated with sexual motivation. Estrogen to some extent, but sort of testosterone seems to be the main driver here. Okay. Questions about this? All right. So, what happens during sex, right? This is the question that a couple of individuals, researchers named Masters and Johnson, started to become interested in sort of late 50s, early 60s. Okay, up to this point, right? We've got this budding sort of area of psychology. We've got Freud, who's been talking about sex forever and ever, right? And you have to be a doorknob not to recognize that sexual motivation isn't something that drives people's behavior, right? But up to this point, very little research sort of actually looking at physiologically what goes on during sexual intercourse, right? Because again, it's kind of taboo, right? It's a tricky thing. And so up to this point, research in the late 50s, early 60s, research on sexual behavior, largely based on self-report stuff, okay? But what Masters and Johnson were interested in is, so, okay, sexual activity seems to be universal human behavior, right? And there seems to be sort of a kind of pattern that goes through what is sort of the typical response style during intercourse, okay? And so very, very controversial. And what Masters and Johnson did is they went through and started conducting large-scale experiments, experimental studies, so lab-based studies, and in some initial studies recruited 382 women, 312 men. So lots and lots of people. Invited people to participate in their research, but the requirements to be involved in this research was that participants needed to be able to achieve orgasm and to be willing to be observed during masturbation or intercourse. And then two, what they did is they brought people into the lab and either observed them with sort of had some physiological sensors and stuff like that, and observed them during masturbation or intercourse, and intercourse with randomly assigned couples. Okay, so if you're involved in this research, I come in, someone else comes in, get paired up, and then sort of investigators watch sort of record measurements during sexual activity. Okay. And based on this research, this was sort of groundbreaking stuff. No one had ever done this before for probably obvious reasons. But what Masters and Johnson put together was what they called the sexual response cycle. Okay. And so based on physiological, again, their interest was what's going on physiologically in the body during sex. And so what they identified as 4 stages in the complete sexual response cycle. First, excitement. Here, physiologically, the body's preparing for intercourse in response to physical or psychological stimulation. Okay, this could be manual, like physical manipulation, or having fantasies, thoughts, and things like this. And what we see is vasocongestion, right? So increased blood flow to the genitals, vaginal lubrication, increased heart rate, respiration, blood pressure. So the body's starting to get sort of worked up and ready for sexual activity. Stage 2, they identified as the plateau. This is during the act of sex, excitement prior to orgasm. What Masters and Johnson found: elevated heart rate, blood pressure, and respiration, muscle tension, full erection in males, retraction of the clitoris in women. So we're getting sort of physiological changes that are being made prior to orgasm. Stage 3, this is orgasm, peak physiological arousal, muscle contractions, euphoria, release of tension, involuntary contraction of the pelvis, ejaculation in males, right? And then 4th phase here is going to be resolution. So this is going to be the reduction of arousal, hanging out up here physiologically, sort of reduction in that physiological arousal following sexual stimulation. Okay, and so this is what Masters and Johnson identified as the typical or the normal response style or physiological reactions that characterize sexual activity across men and women. Okay. So again, groundbreaking research. No one had ever done this stuff before, right? I mean, people have been having sex forever, but no one had studied it, at least at the physiological level, what was going on in a systematic way. Okay, but huge criticisms of Masters and Johnson's research, right? First criticism that often comes up is representativeness of the sample, okay? Someone tell me why we might have concerns with the representative of Masters and Johnson's sample.
Was it all young adults?
I'm not actually sure age range on this. I mean, this was early 60s. I'm guessing that sort of older, more traditional individuals may not have been quite as interested as jumping into the mix here, but so it could be, yeah, sort of young. But Kate, I would make the argument that for young people, sort of that's sort of peak reproductivity. So I might say, well, this is who we should be looking at. But you're right. So if there was an age skew, right, that might not take into account maybe differences that occur sort of later on as people sort of continue on through development. Okay. What other concerns might we have about the representativeness of the sample?
Just by being observed, it might change the way that they interact with each other in sexual contact. Yeah.
So one, I'm not certain, but probably being observed during sexual contact might start to change how our bodies respond. And also, just by definition, right, we've got a unique subset of individuals, right? If I went through and surveyed everybody at the university and said, hey, who wants to come into my lab and have sex while we sort of hook you up with sensors and watch you, I probably wouldn't get a whole lot of takers, right? And so the question is, in terms of, so are the people who were pulled into this study representative of sort of people in general, right? So some concerns with the representativeness of the sample. We got a question up in the chat. Did they include gay people? Nope. These were all heterosexual couples, right? And so, or at least people who identified sort of in the study as heterosexual, right? And so some concerns with the sample here. Okay. Second thing, and this is a big one that Masters and Johnson have been criticized for, is qualifying in their stages. Orgasm is part of the typical sexual response. Okay. Subsequent research has found that only about 30% of women report always having orgasms with a partner. Okay. But when we go through and we take a look and sort of look into this further, women much more likely to report nearly always or always experiencing orgasm alone versus with a sexual partner, right? And so what Masters and Johnson have been criticized for is qualifying orgasm, particularly for women, as part of the normal response cycle, suggesting that if you don't achieve orgasm, then that's abnormal or you're having an abnormal response, okay? But when we go through and we survey women, about 2/3 report satisfaction with the frequency, consistency of orgasm within a relationship, right? But by definition, if we're saying orgasm is part of the normal sexual response, what we're saying is at least 1/3 of the women, or all women, sort of at least 1/3 of the time, aren't experiencing a normal sexual response, which starts to become problematic, right? Last thing, criticism, failing to consider meaning and cultural influence, right? Sex sort of has tremendous amount of cultural weight in terms of who we have it with, when it occurs, sort of the roles that people take in this, right? And Masters and Johnson completely divorces that, right? Masters and Johnson sort of randomly assigning couples, right? So there's no, hey, how you doing, get to know you. Like sort of learn who are you, who am I, like sort of this type of thing. It is just a straight physiological interaction, right? Now, Masters and Johnson would say, well, the purpose of the study isn't to look at the cultural meaning of sex or sort of how sex develops in relationships and things along those lines. Masters and Johnson, again, was focused on like what physically is going on in your body. All right. And the question is what physically goes on in my body during sort of excitement plateau, orgasm resolution, is that different than what that would look like if I'm having relations with someone outside of a relationship? I don't know. Probably a lot of the similar things are happening, right? But people, sort of this is a foundational study, and people say, well, yeah, that's fine. You've looked at physiologically what's going on, but we're sort of divorcing that from the context that this behavior often takes place in. Okay, so some groundbreaking research, but not without controversy, pros and cons, like everything else. Okay. Other thing, as noted, what didn't happen in Masters and Johnson's research is looking at sexual orientation. Okay. Now remember, we have sex, biological sex. This is sort of male, female, intersex, right? We have gender existing on a continuum. My identification as sort of my association with or experience of being consistent with what is societally prescribed as male versus female. But then we have sexual orientation, and these three things are different, right? Sexual orientation referring to the physical or romantic attraction to members of the same or opposite sex. Okay. Now, historically, what we've done is we've categorized people as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, or gay or lesbian, depending on sort of biological sex, bisexual or heterosexual. But as we start to sort of look into this more and sort of start to do research, people don't fall into these categories quite as nicely as we maybe would have thought or hoped, right? What we're finding as we go through and research this, and it's starting to become sort of more obvious within culture, is that sexual orientation, like gender identification, better understood as a continuum. Okay, what we find is that sexual orientation does not necessarily perfectly correspond to sexual behavior. Okay, so if we look at big national level survey stuff, at least in the U.S., and estimates will vary, but about 2 to 3% of individuals in the U.S. identifying as gay or lesbian. Traditionally, identification as bisexual was less, although that's starting to change a little bit. Again, it's sort of this sort of orientation towards I have to have specific groups to put people in. Bisexual, not as frequent, but I think some evidence starting to see that starting to change. But when we look at the frequency of same-sex activity, that's much, much higher, right? So we've got 2 to 3% of people in the U.S. identifying as gay or lesbian. But other research, somewhere around, say, 13% of women, 5% of men engaging in same-sex activity. Okay. Now, some of this research suggests that sexual orientation and sexual activity a little bit more fluid in women as opposed to men. But the take-home message here is that how I identify as gay, straight, lesbian doesn't perfectly correlate with my actual behavior. Okay, and so again, recognizing this, and this is sort of gets into big culture wars and things along those lines, right? But from my standpoint, as a behavioral scientist, it doesn't make sense to say, okay, here, these are sort of what I would prefer. So what we're doing here is being guided by sort of what's actually happening on the ground, right? And so what you'll see in some of this research is that researchers won't even identify and use labels like gay, lesbian in some of this research. If I'm wanting to be sort of operationally consistent, I might identify this as men who have sex with men, right? So I don't care about who I'm surveying, whether or not they identify as gay or not. So what we're looking at as a specific behavior is sexual activity with members of the same versus opposite sex. Okay, but it starts to get really confusing, right? We don't like it when things are confusing. We like it when things are simple. But what we're seeing is when we start to conflate biological sex with gender identity, with sexual orientation, things start to get tricky, right? And so research in this area now makes clear distinctions between these, recognizing that there is some overlap, right? If I'm a standard member of society, I'm a cisgender male who's heterosexual, who exclusively has sex with women, right? That's easy, right? Or I'm a cisgender woman who identifies as heterosexual and exclusively has sexual relations with men. That's easy, right? And we're getting a big chunk of the population with that, but there's a whole group of individuals sort of there in the middle that's not being captured, and that's where sort of a lot of this research has taken, and sort of recognizing sort of the diversity and continuum of this stuff. Questions about sex, gender, sexual orientation? All right. So and honestly, there have been cultural changes, right, where we start to see like this sort of becoming more and more common. People starting to recognize the differences in some of these things, or the separation, which again is something that's changed over the past my lifetime, 40 years. Okay. All right. But the big question, $1,000,000 question, is what's the basis of sexual orientation? Okay. Like what makes people what are the influences that involve someone identifying as gay, lesbian, even if we're just looking at those two sort of kind of semi arbitrary groups. What we do see, based on the research, is that sort of within psychological science, strong indication that sexual orientation is at least to a great degree determined, biologically determined, right? We don't know the specific mechanism, but a number of lines of research suggest that what we're working with is some, like everything else, right? Sort of a biological influences that sort of may or may not have some influences related to sort of cultural, environmental stuff, right? So again, when we're looking at this, some things that point to biological orientation or biological mechanisms of sexual orientation, awareness of same-sex attraction occurring at puberty. Okay, so very early on, right? Now, identifying as sort of individuals identify gay and lesbian starts to sort of maybe get delayed until adolescence or early adulthood and there's a lot of social reasons why that might happen, right? But sort of when we go through an interview and conduct qualitative research with individuals who do identify as gay or lesbian, identifying sort of, this started to happen around puberty, right? So it's happening early, before people actually identify as gay or lesbian. But why does this sort of early onset make some sense? What happens at puberty? No one knows what happens at puberty. I start to become aware of sort of my sort of attractions, right? Sort of that starts to come through individuals, young people are starting to hit sexual maturity, right? And so starting to understand, sort of identify, like, oh boy, I'm actually developing attractions, right? So again, we see this start to come out. Other things that we see is family studies, twin studies, looking at heritability of sexual orientation could be about at like 65%, right? So we see, if we are looking at fraternal twins versus biological twins, concordance in sexual orientation, stronger in identical twins versus fraternal twins. Again, suggesting sort of, if we say heritability of intelligence at about 50%, estimates of sexual orientation about 65%. So again, a strong genetic component to this. Again, twin studies looking at concordance of attraction, greater concordance of same-sex attraction and identical relative to fraternal twins. And then when we start to get into biology, again, we don't know specific mechanisms that start to influence sexual attraction, but there's some research, and it's talked about in your, Myers talks about this in your text, some structural differences within your hypothalamus. Okay, someone remind me what the hypothalamus does, or some of the stuff hypothalamus does. Anybody remember?
Does it process memory formation?
Okay, that's hippocampus, different age structure.
Isn't it like, modeling maintenance?
Yeah. So again, and sort of stuff coming up in the in the chat. Yeah, maintaining homeostasis, regulating the body. A lot of life functions like sort of food, sleep, reproductive sort of drives and things like that, maintained by hypothalamus. And so it would make sense that sexual orientation could have some correlates in terms of this subcortical structure. Okay, so evidence of some differences in prenatal hormone levels. This is really interesting. Differences in fingerprint ratio across gay and straight men. Okay, so everybody, sort of look at your fingers real quick. Okay, what we typically see in sort of just on average across individuals, that if we were to count the number of ridges and map out the ridges on your fingertips, what we typically see is a greater number of ridges in your right finger versus your left finger. Okay. But what we see is that ratio, the difference between the right and the left ridge fingers in women is less than men. Women tend to have a sort of more equal number of ridges in their fingertips. But we also see that individuals who identify as gay men also have less of a more equal ratio of ridges on fingertips across their right and left fingers than do heterosexual men, right? Which is strange. Now, like, your fingerprint doesn't determine whether or not you're gay or straight, right? But what it does suggest, fingerprints complete at 16 weeks in utero very, very quickly, right? So what it suggests is that something is going on early on, sort of that's starting to sort of influence sexual orientation sort of later on down the road. Also see early evidence of gender nonconformity in children who later go on to identify as gay or lesbian, which again, before kids are even thinking about sort of sexual orientation, we're seeing some indications sort of early on of behaviors that aren't sort of conforming to traditional gender roles. We also see that sexual orientation is not responsive to conversion or reparative therapies. These are bad news. As a society, the American Psychological Association has said this is not a good thing, right? We can't, at present, there's no way through psychological treatment to make you not gay if you're attracted to members of the same sex, okay? And sort of the impact on individuals who have been sort of involved in these types of treatments looks to be not good. And so again, just from a straight ethical standpoint, huge concerns with some of these interventions, okay? Any questions on sexual orientation or some of this research? Again, at the end of the day, what determines sexual orientation? We don't know, right? We are guessing that it's biological in nature based on these converging lines of evidence. But if you said, what is the physiological mechanism that determines sexual orientation? We don't know. It's an area of continued study. Like most everything else in psychology, I don't know, you get too far down the surface, we say, I don't know, right? But an interesting sort of line of investigation in this area. Yep. Who jumped in there?
You talked about how there was like structural differences in the hypothalamus.
Yeah.
Are there differences between like male and female brains that might give a reason for women being more fluid?
Not, Olivia, that I'm aware of right now. And again, I think it's an interesting question. And even sort of this research looking at different cell structures in the hypothalamus across gay men and straight men. I always get a little bit nervous about this because I think anytime we say, okay, here's the part of my brain that determines this, it starts to get sort of into an oversimplification, and people kind of latch onto that. But again, if we're thinking about anything I do has to have some sort of biological basis, right? So in terms of complex interactions, how that might go through and take a look. I'm not sure about male-female differences in the hypothalamus, but that's a good question. I'm gonna look in that and see what I can find. Cool. Yeah, good thinking. All right. Real quick, last slide. We're social creatures. We're humans. We need to be around other people. If we're not, bad stuff happens in general. Variability, might be a loner, might be a social person, but at the end of the day, if I'm not interacting with other people, it tends to be bad news. We see this. From a biological evolutionary standpoint, this connectedness helps with child rearing, safety, security. Like, we're not overly capable sort of attack defense animals. We don't have big teeth or long claws, or we're not overly agile, right? So our strength comes in numbers, right? We see social psychology demonstrating huge drives for conformity. We'll talk about this a little bit. We don't like being different than other people. We might say that we do. Like, oh, I'm a unique person. I'm different than everybody else. When push comes to shove, we're much more comfortable being like other people. And if we're not, we have huge intrinsic motivation to get back in line. Quality of our social relationships associated with self-esteem, quality of life, adjustment, very strong associations there. If I don't have friends, if I don't have romantic partners, if I don't have anybody to talk to, I'm generally not thinking that's a cool idea. We start to see impacts on quality of life. And then we have isolation, loss of personal relationships. If we're put in situations where we're not allowed to interact with other people, we do quite poorly in those. Okay. So, not anything that should be shocking there. Just make sure you take a look at that. Lecture summary, comprehension check slides. Make sure that you go through, take a look at that. Any questions on this material, any material we've covered up to this point. Again, if you need to skedaddle, go through, take that. But again, if you have questions, I'm sort of here and sort of make sure that people are on point with stuff.
Doctor, I have a question.
Yeah, Michael.
So, regarding the previous slides, they talked about some of the biological differences they tend to notice in people who are heterosexual and those who are homosexual. Do those same differences apply to those who are bisexual?
I don't know. That starts to get into, again, sort of this continuum. It starts to get a little bit tricky in how we actually go through and research this, right? Again, and it requires people to sort of identify as bisexual. Again, traditionally for a lot of within the LGBTQ community, historically, sort of some stigma about sort of this, or some people have written about some stigma towards individuals who identify as bisexual as like, oh, you're kind of fence sitting, sort of one side or the other type of thing, right? And again, we tend to sort of focus on, we prefer clean-cut categories. And so research with individuals who are a little bit more fluid and sort of have sexual attraction to members of both sex, we have less research about those individuals. And I think a lot of it's just because it's not clear cut, right? But I'm not sure about if any of that research generalizes to individuals who report attractions to both sexes. Again, I'll take a look at that. That's a good question. And again, what we want to do is think about like, oh, sort of maybe there's this cluster of cells in the hypothalamus that sort of gets bigger or smaller, and sort of that determines on a sort of a grade, sort of my attraction to same or opposite sex. It's probably considerably more complex than that, almost certainly more complex than that. But again, you're right. So this idea is, okay, we found sort of this cluster of cells in the hypothalamus that looks to be correlated, not perfectly, but correlated with sexual orientation. What does that tell us? What about those cells or sort of this mechanism might start to inform us about how orientation develops and things like that? And so it's a cool area, very, very controversial. But yeah, Michael, I'll go through and take a look and see if I can find anything on that. Yeah. Other questions?
Why do gay or lesbian identified people have sex more frequently than straight people?
Vance, I'm not sure that that's true.
You said on the sexual orientation slide, frequency of same-sex activity is much higher than in straight females. Or than in straight.
Oh, okay. Here, let me pop that back up just so make sure that we're on the same page here.
Yeah, there it is.
Oh, there we go. Okay. All right. So are you okay? So this is sort of just so this is highlighting the difference between how people identify in terms of sexual orientation versus the occurrence of same-sex behavior. So, and maybe I misunderstood your question, Vance. I thought you were asking why individuals who identify as gay or lesbian have more sex than people who identify as heterosexual. But I think I misread your question there. Yeah. So what this is saying is that women tend to report higher levels or higher occurrence of same-sex activity than men do. Now, why is that? I don't know. I mean, a couple of hypotheses. It could be just reporting bias, right? I mean, if you, and this gets into gender norms, right? If you ask a guy, like, hey, do you think that other guy is hot? Gender norms would say, oh, no, I have to fall back on my traditional sort of masculine, sort of, no, I don't think other guys are hot. Whereas women in sort of our society be like, oh, yeah, no, she's hot, she's sort of beautiful or attractive or something along those lines, right? And if we take that and then sort of go into, have you ever had sexual activity with another man? What we may see is, even in confidential situations, men may be less likely to report. But I'm guessing that the individuals doing this research have sort of taken that into account. And so it's tough to know whether or not it's a biological issue or a cultural issue. I don't think we know, right? But what we see, again, sort of consistently in this research is that women will at least acknowledge more frequently acknowledge same-sex activity as compared to men, which plays into some stereotypes and things along those lines, but it's just kind of what data have identified, at least to this point.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, sorry about that. I was like, I thought you were bringing in new information, Vance. I was like, I don't know. I would have to take a look at that to sort of see if that's something.
I was kind of confused by the way that was worded.
Yeah. So again, those are just trying to provide sort of numbers to say, yeah, in research it looks like sort of this is the number of people who identify as gay and lesbian, right? But this is the number of people who acknowledge same-sex activity, which is much higher than the number of people who identify as gay and lesbian, indicating that there's not a perfect one-to-one correlation between my sexual orientation and my actual sexual behavior.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Other questions? This is good stuff. All right. Well, if anything comes up, go through and shoot me an email. We'll have SI session tonight. I think Samantha said that was 6:30, so make sure that you jump into that if you're able. We'll have a review session tomorrow at 5. Make sure I'm not trying to double book myself with stuff. Okay, nope, we're good to go. So we'll have a review session at 5. Again, that'll be recorded. But if you have questions, can't make it, let me know. I'll make sure to cover those so you can catch up later. Otherwise, good luck with prep. Same situation as always. Wednesday quiz will just be like every other quiz that we've done up to this point. You guys got this down. You got the drill. You're pros at it now. But let me know if anything comes up in your prep.